genel müdürü diyebileceğimiz Linux International non-profit bir örgütlenme. Ana amacı Linux'ü dünyada geliştirme konusunda firmaların ettiği bir üst düzey örgütlenme diyelim. LKD konusunda çok kısa bir şey söyleyeyim. Arada bir size bir 5 dakikalık tanıtım şeyi vereceğiz. Hem de konuşmacımız orada dinlenmiş olacak. Bir ara vereceğiz. İkinci arada daha çok sorular ve tartışma kısmı olacak. LKD bilmiyor olabilirsiniz. 95'ten beri var olan bir grup, dernek olarak 2000'de kuruldu. İşte bir sürü etkinlik yapıyoruz. İşte Ankara ve İstanbul'da sürekli seminerlerimiz var. Anadolu'nun her yerine dolaşıyoruz. Ve en önemli etkinliğimiz de Mayıs'ın ortasında şenlik afişini görmüşsünüzdür. Linux şenliğidir, 3. şenlik. John maddog sektörün çok eski biri. Linux'un gelişmesine büyük ölçüde katkıda olmuş. Hem bilişim sektöründe hem üniversitede çalışmış biri. Bugün de işte Linux'ün dünü, bugünü, geleceği konusunda düşüncelerini bizimle paylaşacak.
Okay, thank you very much. We still seem to be having some type of problem with the projection system, but we're going to try and do without that problem. This is part of a much longer trip. I started off in London, England, and then I went to Israel, and I've come here to Turkey, and I go on to Germany, and then back to the United States. Unfortunately, in London, my laptop computer and all of my computer supplies were stolen. And so when I got to Israel, I had to borrow a notebook computer. And fortunately, I had a copy of Canopic's Linux in my bag that I always carry with me. Some people would think it odd that I always carry a copy of Linux with me, but it comes in handy. Oh, okay. And I was able to install it on the computer, and then from there install a copy of Fedora Linux, which I got from a magazine at the London airport. And so that's how I recovered my system. Okay. All right. I don't have to hold that. That's good. So we're going to see if, oh, look at that. That works great. Okay, where's that? First of all, my lawyers tell me that now, more than ever, I have to point out that Linux is a trademark of Linus Torvalds in several countries around the world. And he wants Linux to be protected as a name so that you can use it for anything that you legitimately want to use it for. If you would like to create a Linux brand of cars, or a Linux brand of food, or even a piece of software with Linux in the name, the only thing we do is ask that you register it with us so that we can protect the name. Now actually, the first use of Unix was here in Istanbul. Well, actually it was in Istanbul, here in Turkey. And if you go to the palace, you can find out that Mehmet the Conqueror was using black Unix to guard his harem, to guard his wives. He also had white Unix, and I'm not sure whether, how that fits in. Maybe the black Unix was SCO, and the white Unix was everybody else. But when we talk about free software, of course, we're not necessarily talking about free of cost, although sometimes Linux is free. Richard Stallman likes to point out that the freedom is in looking at the source code, being able to change the source code, and being able to redistribute those changes. Now, the way that works does sometimes make the software free of cost. You can pull it down off of the internet. And you could use it, something like OpenOffice. Just pull it down and use it as it is. However, the real benefit to using free software is the fact that the money that you would normally pay for a license for the software, you can actually pay somebody to help you tailor the software more to your needs. And there's a lot of people, including a gentleman named Steve Ballmer from Microsoft, who's going to be here in Turkey this week. He's going to tell you that free software is going to decimate the software industry. He's going to tell you that free software is like a virus and it's evil. And the reason he's telling you this is because he is the 7th richest man in the world. And he made his money off of the money that a lot of people pay for his products. So you might say he is biased, okay? Now, I am not the 7th richest man in the world, nor even the 100th richest man in the world. I'm probably more like the 15 millionth richest man in the world, if that. So I'm not making a lot of money by standing up here and telling you that you should be thinking about free software. I'm standing up here and telling you this because I believe that until everybody can contribute equally to the development of something as important as software, that we will never have people who feel confident that they'll be able to go forward with their country and with their lives. And before I get finished today, I hope to have convinced you of that. Now I'm going to take you back in time, the time between 1943 and the early 1980s, because that was a time when computers were huge and would fill this room with vacuum tubes. And the computers cost many millions of dollars. And that's when $1 million US was a lot of money. And computers would run one program at a time. And you never turned them off because the computer was more expensive than you were. So you would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to run your job on the computer because that was the time that you had. And computers would only execute perhaps 100,000 instructions a second, not 3 billion instructions per second. And memory. Memory was $100,000 a megabyte. But we didn't even talk about megabyte back in those days. Nobody said megabyte. We said kilobyte, and we thought that was a lot. 1,000 bytes. That was huge. In fact, I remember the first time I put together my own microcomputer. It had 12 kilobytes of main memory. And the computer cost $1,200 US back in 1977. To put this in comparison, I bought a pickup truck for about 3 times that price. So now you go out and buy a computer today, take 3 times that amount of money and try and buy a car of any size. See how far you get. So computers were huge. And part of writing a program for a computer was to write it so that you used every possible iota of power for that computer. You tried to tailor the program exactly to what the customer wanted. And the customer would come to you and say, here are the inputs I have, here is the output I would like to see, and here are the steps that I think you need to take between the input and the output. And the first thing you would do is you would write a contract with that customer. And if your software did not work, then the customer did not pay you. If your software was late, the customer did not pay you. If the documentation was not good, the customer did not pay you. If there were bugs in it, the customer did not pay you. Isn't that refreshing? How many of you have ever gone down to the local store and bought a piece of software and taken it home and put it on your computer didn't work. Oh, come on. Be honest. You all have. Or else you've never used a computer before, or else you've only used it with free software. But in those days, you had a contract, and that contract meant that the software had to work. But the software cost a lot of money. You might pay $1 million for a piece of software. And of course, that was a lot of money. But the computer cost even more money. And consequently, the small number of computers generated a small market for software. Now, at that time, about the period of 1969, free software did exist. This is not something that's new. Free software, because I was a student in 1969, I know that free software existed. There was an organization called DECUS, the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society, and some of the older people down here in the front row are going, yeah, I remember DECUS. And they had members who would write software and contribute it to the DECUS library. And you ask, say, why did they do this? Well, they said, I needed to write the software anyway for my own use. Why shouldn't I give it away to somebody? Why shouldn't I make their life easier? And then another person, maybe not as magnanimous, would say, I wrote the software for my own use, and I gave it away, and maybe that person can help me make it better. Or maybe if I give it to 10 people, they can all contribute something to it to make it better. And so the next time I go to use it, it's even better software. And some people contributed to software because the next time they went to the DECUS meeting, everybody said, oh, you wrote that great piece of software. You know, and they liked that type of a feeling. Guess what? More than 30 years later, it's the same reasons why people write free software. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So they had this library, and the library would print a catalog of the software that was available. And you would pay some money. Now, back in those days, the software arrived on paper tape. And you would pay $5 to get this paper tape with a text editor on it, and $5 to get a paper tape with an assembler on it, because the paper tape was longer. And what you were paying for was not the software itself, but the concept of having to stick the paper tape in the punch the paper tape, and mail it to you. It was a service of distributing this software. Now, back in those days, $5 was a lot of money. $5 could buy you 10 pitchers of beer. So as a student, you had a choice. Text editor, 10 pitchers of beer. I think you can see where I made most of my decisions. But I found out something. Once I had that paper tape in my hand, I could go to the school store, I could buy more blank paper tape, and I could put that paper tape through the ASR teletype and make copies of it. And then I could sell those copies to my roommates. So if I made 10 copies, not only could I sell each one for $1, I'd sell 10 copies and I would get back my $5, and they could get 10 more pitchers of beer. This was America. This is capitalism, okay? And so DECUS was the first experience with free software that I ever had. Now, also in 1969, along came an operating system called Unix. It was developed at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. Oh, I have to use my pointer now. He was kind enough to get it for me. This is a PDP-7 computer. This is the ASR-33 teletype I was talking about, but it does not have a paper tape punch because this one has magnetic tape. Ooh. They were very small magnetic tapes. But Unix was the first time that somebody said, we're not going to worry about how slow the computer is. We're not going to worry about how much it costs, because what is happening is that the price of computers is dropping and the speed is increasing. And we foresee a time in the future when human beings' time is going to be worth more than the computer's time. And so we're going to make an operating system that no matter what computer you put it on, you're going to have the same programming interfaces and you're going to have the same human interfaces, because that is going to be the most valuable thing. And so they started to create this Unix operating system. And finally, one more item that happened in 1969, probably not noticed by too many people in the world, except for his father and mother. Linus Torvalds was born in Helsinki, Finland. And it took a certain amount of time for that to become known by the world. Now, Unix started to spread. And out of Bell Laboratories, it spread to various universities. And a lot of people thought back in those days that Unix was free. But it was not free. It was not free of money, and it was not free as in freedom. Because each university had to sign a license with AT&T. And you had to be a certain type of university. You had to be a research university. To do good research, like Columbia, or like Berkeley, or like Stanford University. Now, about this time, I taught in a small 2-year technical college. We did not do research. Unix was not available to us for $350 for our entire campus. When I called up AT&T and said I would like to have a copy of Unix for my students to see, they said it will cost you $160,000 US for your first CPU. If you want to put it on a second CPU, it'll cost you $160,000 more. If you want to put it on a third CPU, it's only another $160,000. You can see a pattern forming here. This is a telephone company. They don't think about things in quantity. And of course, I could not afford that $160,000 because I was just a small technical college. And so I was not able to show my students how an operating system was built or how compilers worked. Now, another way that Unix was not free was the fact that your students, if they saw the source code, could become contaminated. If they graduated from your school and they went to another place and they were doing work and they used any of the techniques inside of Unix, they could be hauled into court and sued because part of that license said that they would not utilize any of the trade secrets that were inside of Unix. And people said, well, just tell us what the trade secrets are. We won't use them. And AT&T said, if we tell you what the secrets are, then they won't be secrets anymore. Catch it 22. And so those are the reasons why Unix was not free. Now, people talk about Berkeley Unix. And Berkeley Unix was developed at the University of California, Berkeley. They kept taking their code and sending it back to AT&T in New Jersey. And AT&T in New Jersey kept taking their code and putting it into System 5 and then removing all their copyright notices. This, of course, was illegal, but we were the telephone company. And after a while, various companies like Digital and Hewlett-Packard and IBM started to make their own versions of Unix. And Unix started to move in many different directions. And the goal of having that one set of programming interfaces and that one set of user interfaces started to disappear. But more importantly, each one of these companies only distributed their product in binary form. And so you couldn't see anymore how Unix was made. Now, I belonged to an organization at that time called Usenix. And the members of Usenix were made up of universities, companies, users of Unix. And we would meet together and talk about the new features going into Unix and what they meant, what good were they. And as long as Unix was distributed in source code form, this was okay. But about 1980, 77 to 1980, somebody would get up and talk about something they were working on, and you would say, where is the source code? And they would go, oh, well, I can't show it to you because I'm working for this company, and they won't let me show you what I'm working on. Or my university is doing work for this private corporation over here, and they will not allow me to show you the results of my work because they're paying for it. Never mind the fact that the university was subsidized by the government and subsidized by the people because that company had put some small amount of money into this research. The people were going to have to pay for that again. And so Usenix, who was not used to this, would boo and hiss these people. But over a number of years, they stopped with the booing and the hissing because it had become commonplace. And people forgot what it was like to deal with the source code. They forgot what it was like to have a large community of people come together and all work towards a common goal. And they forgot what it was like to be able to distribute that software freely to anybody who needed it. And then in the period of 1977 to about 1983, something else happened. The microcomputer came out. Believe it or not, there was a time where music not only come on a shiny plastic disc. There was a time when you could not go down to your local PC store and buy a piece of shrink-wrap software. You could not go down to your local PC store and buy a PC because there was no PC store. Because before this time, computers would cost tens of thousands of dollars, and nobody could go down to the store and put $10,000 on the shelf and say, give me a computer, any computer. Now, they couldn't do that. But when microcomputers started to come out, people said, now we can mass produce computers, make them everywhere. But they still had a problem. The software was still expensive. And they said, maybe we can manufacture software the same way that we manufacture hardware. And so the software that would cost $1 million, we sell it to 1,000 people, and now it's just $1,000 a copy. If it costs $1 million and we sell it to 1 million people, it's $1 a copy. Unless you're Microsoft, then it's $2 a copy. And so they started to do this, and companies would start up and they would hire 100 engineers, and they would work and work and work and work. They would get their software. They'd sell it to 1,000 customers. And the customers were happy. And each year they would generate one problem report and one request for new functionality. So 2 pieces of paper, this is before email, 2 pieces of paper would come back to these 1,000 engineers, or 100 engineers. Each engineer would only have to read 20 pieces and respond to it. That's not hard. Read 20 pieces of paper a year and respond to it. No problem. The problem came a little bit later. It is now the year 2000. My company has grown. I have 150 engineers.
but I have 4.5 million customers. Each customer generates one problem report and one request for new functionality. Do you see the problem? I have 9 million pieces of paper coming back to my 150 engineers. There's no way that they can read 60,000 pieces of paper per engineer. This is why back in 1980 or 83, when you had a problem and you picked up the phone and you called the company, you typically got the president of the company on the phone or the chief technical officer. Today, what you get is Muzak. For at least the first 20 minutes, you've got Muzak. And that's just to see whether you're really mad or not. Because if you're really mad, you still stay on the phone past the 20 minutes. Until you get that first mechanical voice. Please press 1 for this option. It's all because of this. 4.5 million customers. And that is a small number. Now, freedom of software is not new. As I showed you before, in 1969, we had freedom of software. But in 1984, one person, Richard Stallman, a student at MIT, said, I don't like the fact that Unix is no longer distributed in source code form. I don't like the fact that I can't see the source code anymore and change it to meet my needs. And I don't like the fact that I can't redistribute the changes to people who want it. And so he started a project called GNU, which stands for GNU is not Unix. Because he wanted to say that I am going to distribute this code in source code. And he started to write an entire operating system based on Unix, except that the source code was available. And at first it was a text editor, and then it was command interpreters, and then a compiler and libraries. And there was other people who also wrote software that distributed in source code. SendMail, which probably handles more electronic mail than any other mail carrying system. Bind, which is a name server. Postgres, which is a complete database program. There were several different operating systems that came from the Berkeley software distribution, and those were freely distributed. And X-Windows systems, which uses the graphics or creates the graphics, which you're seeing projected here, and Kerberos, which is an authentication system, all were generated as free software. So a large portion of software was being created, everything necessary to create an operating system except for one thing, the kernel. The very core of the operating system, the thing which handles the hardware and the devices and keeps the different processes and tasks separate from each other. And so in 1991, Linus Torvalds, who was a student at the University of Helsinki, decided that he was going to write the kernel of the operating system. And he started to do this, and he recognized it was going to be a big task. And so he sent a message out across the internet and said, who would like to help me with this? Who would like to make it be better? And so they started. And in about 1993 to 1994, certain distributions started to occur. And for those of you who have been with Linux for a long time, you remember some of these. Soft landing systems, Yggdrasil, Slackware is still in existence, Transameritek. Some of these are no longer in business because they were too early. People were not ready for Linux. Finally, in 1994, version 1.0 of the kernel came out, and other distributions such as Red Hat and SUSE began to appear. In May of 1994, I met Linus Torvalds. I brought him to the United States. A friend of mine suggested I do that. And we had him do a presentation to Deaconess about his project, the Linux kernel. And I looked at this operating system and I said, this is more than just a toy operating system. This is more than just a hacker's operating system. It was a good rendition of Unix. And so I convinced him to port it to the Alpha processor, to allow it to be a 64-bit operating system, and also to remove what we call Intel-isms from the system. One of the benefits of using Unix is the fact it runs on many different types of hardware. And when you get an operating system to do that, you are forced to make a large portion of the operating system hardware neutral. When you do that, you make the operating system much more stable and much more secure than just utilizing one hardware piece. By moving into a 64-bit system, we got it to address more memory. To give you an idea of how big 2 to the 64th is, if I was to fill up a 1 gigabyte disk drive every second of the day, every day of the year, I could do that for 586 years and still not run out of address space. To put it another way, I could store 128 bytes of data for every square millimeter of the surface of the Earth, including oceans, and still address it all at one time in a 64-bit data space. It's huge. It's gigantic. And I wanted Linux to be able to support this so that we could do research with how to use really large address spaces to address really large problems. In January of 1995, the project started for real because up until that time, Linus was still trying to bring out version 1.2 of the kernel. And by November of 1995, Red Hat shipped the first alpha distribution. 9 months of taking an operating system from one architecture to another. This was the fastest I had ever seen it, and it was all done by this mysterious Linux community. A community of people who actually bought processors, bought CPUs to help with this project. In 1994 and 1995, there was a slight problem in the computer community. Supercomputer companies were going out of business. Companies like Cray, ECL, were all going out of business because what they would do is spend a huge amount of money to generate a computer that they were the only ones who had the architecture. They had to write their own operating system, their own compilers, their own debuggers, their own applications. Each one of them was different. And they could not afford to do this and keep making money. So two people, Dr. Donald Becker and Dr. Thomas Sterling, said we need supercomputers. There are various projects in this world, things we're doing in this world that we have to have that type of power. And they said maybe we could make the equivalent of a supercomputer out of inexpensive PCs hooked together with high-speed networking. And high-speed networking could be as simple as 10 megabit per second Ethernet. And they started to do this, and they found out that it worked very well, so well that they could create a supercomputer with the power of an IBM SP2 for 1/40th of the price, using new components. It'd be even cheaper if they used old components. And they could solve a huge number of problems with it. Now, not every type of problem, but problems what we call decomposable, where you have a huge problem and you say, I'm going to use one CPU to work on this portion of it, another CPU to work on this portion of it, and so forth and so on. At the end, you bring all the answers back together and you come up with the total answer. So what types of problems are these? Image rendering. How many of you saw the movie Titanic? Most expensive movie of all time. It took 160 alpha processors working together an entire year to render that movie. If they'd used traditional programs, one computer, it would have taken 160 years to render that movie. And Leonardo DiCaprio wouldn't look anywhere near as good as he does today. He'd be 160 years old. Shrek. How many of you saw Shrek? How many of you don't go to movies? Oh, okay. You're excused then. But each one of these movies, the imaging gets better and better because they keep putting more and more computers on it. Or they make the movie faster so that they can get it all done in time. How many of you saw Lord of the Rings 1, 2, and 3? Well, you know, they had to do all those movies faster and faster because the little hobbits were getting older and older. Okay? So by doing it faster and faster, that makes money too. Image recognition. Let's say I have a satellite up in space, and it's taking lots of pictures of the Earth, pictures maybe of the ocean. And those pictures are looking for something. Now, if the satellite is owned by the military, what it's looking for might be looking for the conning tower of a submarine. Because if the submarine comes to the surface, it may launch a missile and hit your country. Well, it's hard for people to look at those pictures day after day after day. They make mistakes. And all of a sudden, they see this thing appear in the picture, and they go, oh my God, it's a conning tower of a submarine! Launch the missile! And it's a sailboat. You know, when a missile hits a sailboat, it ruins your whole day. The paperwork alone is incredible. Okay? So what you do is you have a computer look at the picture first. And the computer does the analysis. Is that the conning tower of a submarine, or is that a sailboat? And once it determines that it could be the conning tower of a submarine, that's when you have the person look at it, because you want to make special sure that you're not blowing up that sailboat. Beowulf systems allow you to look at a lot more pictures with a lot more clarity than just one computer alone. And it isn't that we didn't know how to do this before, it's that we could not afford to do it before. Weather forecasting. We have known for years how to predict the weather with 100% accuracy 24 hours in advance. The problem is, it always took 48 hours to collect the data and to process it. Do you see the problem? We knew exactly what the weather was going to be 24 hours ago. You could have hired a Boy Scout to hold his hand out the window like that. Rain. A lot cheaper than trying to do the processing. But by increasing the processing speed, we cut down the time from 48 hours to 36 to 24 to 12. And now we can predict with 100% accuracy what the weather is going to be 12 hours in the future. What good does that do? Farmers, go out there and cut as much of your crop today as you can because there's this big hailstorm coming. Don't fill up the space shuttle with fuel because it's a big windstorm coming. All these different things. Now what people want is that they not only want to know what the weather is 24 hours in advance or 12 hours in advance, they want to know what the weather is 12 hours in advance on their block. Not the next block or the block after that, this block. Why? I'm having a party. It's my daughter's wedding. I've been saving up for 47 years for this. She got married late. And it's going to be a big thing. and I want to be perfect, and I want insurance that it's not going to rain on my daughter's party. How much is that insurance going to cost? We need to know what the weather's going to be. Global warming. How does that affect us? How much is it worth to us to know where global warming is going? Modeling in meteors. I had a friend of mine who works at Los Alamos Laboratories in the United States predicting what it's like when a meteor hits the Earth. How much of a dust cloud goes up? How much is the sun going to be blocked out? Is it going to be worse than a nuclear winter? Are we going to see the dinosaurs wiped out from the face of the earth? Will the cockroaches be the only thing surviving? Now, he used to do this with New York City. Goes the asteroid, boom, there goes the Statue of Liberty out in space. After 9/11, he switched to Los Angeles. But he can predict what it will be like, and he needs a supercomputer to do it. Data mining, genome research is now being done with MySQL. It's not just the speed of the process. It's how easy is it for me to share the data that I'm working with my fellow person. Let's say I'm a university in Cambridge, England, and I want to share the genome research with a university in Turkey. I used to use Oracle as a database. But I want to share the data with my university friend, I have to say, unload the data from Oracle. University, do you have an Oracle license? If not, you better buy one, $8,000. Here's the data, you have to load it in. That's a lot of work. With free and open source software, I say, here's an image copy of my disk, take it. Database, data, operating system, everything. Make a copy of the disk, boot it up on your system, you're done. In fact, it's actually cheaper just to buy them a disk these days, a $300 disk, just a disk copy. Here's the disk, boot it up, you're done. Free and open source software is more than just the cost of the software. Virtual reality. Doctors these days can go in and, using virtual reality, do the operation before they do the operation. They allow the computer to simulate what the operation is going to be like, and they allow the computer to say, oh, blood vessel just burst. Well, what can you do to tighten that up? And so when they actually go in to do the real operation, they have a much better idea of where all the vessels are and what's going to happen. And finally, so you think all these things aren't just scientific or engineering. There is a financial house in New York City that deals in commodity futures. This is a very risky business. And so our government tells them that they have to have a certain amount of money in reserve in case their customers come back and say, I want to get my money out of this fund. And I want it now. It used to take them 24 hours to calculate how much money they had in reserve until they bought their Beowulf system. Then it only took them 15 minutes to do the same calculation. So they do this calculation every 15 minutes of the day. This allows them to keep much less money in reserve because they know how much better how much they have to keep. With the difference in the money they reinvested, they made $15 million worth of profit in the first month, which paid for the Beowulf system in the first 5 days. That's a return on investment that a lot of people would like to have. It's not that we didn't know how to do it, it's that we couldn't afford to do it. Now, shortly after this, people found out that Linux actually made the perfect ISP machine. The internet was blossoming. People needed ISPs. People wanted web servers. People wanted, all types of different server systems. And Linux had everything that made a good ISP machine. Solaris was the king of the internet at this time. And Linux had all the feel of Solaris, but could run on inexpensive PCs. And of course, the operating system was free. But not just gratis free. It was free to get the changes that you needed. And so when somebody came along and said, I'm going to break into your server system, you could go and get a patch to solve the problem quickly. How quickly? Very quickly. There was a problem at one time called the ping problem. Windows users found out that they could make very large packets to send over the internet, and when those packets hit a Unix system, it would cause the TCP/IP system to go down. And the Windows users loved this. They just sit there and go, bing, bing, bing, bing. I'm going to put them all down. And they did. But within 4 hours of understanding the problem, the open source community had a patch out on the web, a source code patch. So whether you had a Spark Linux system, or an Intel Linux system, or Motorola Linux system, or an IBM Linux system, PA Precision, you could patch it. The company that I worked for, Digital, had the same problem with their system called Digital Unix. But it took us 2 weeks to get the patch out, not 4 hours. 2 weeks. So which group of customers had the better support? In fact, InfoWeek magazine in 1997 and 1998 gave the award for best support not to Hewlett-Packard, Digital Equipment Corporation, or Sun, or Microsoft, but to the open source community for fixing the bugs so quickly and getting the patches out to the customers so rapidly. After this, there were more ports that followed, not just to the Alpha, but to the Spark and the Motorola. Some people in the Linux community even ported Linux to the Palm Pilot. The original Palm Pilot, the one that only had 2 megabytes of main memory. Of course, you could run Linux on there, but you couldn't really invoke Emacs, the text editor, because Emacs was just too big. In September of 1998, certain databases started to port. There was databases like Informix, Oracle, Sybase, because their customers asked them to do this port. In October of 1998, a lot of the computer companies began to wake up and say, yes, we're going to support Linux. IBM, Hewlett-Packard. And finally, high availability software started to appear in 1999 and 2000. Software that would allow your system, if it failed, to fail over the application so that your application would always be there. This is a type of support, type of high availability that operating systems like Solaris and HPUX were giving at that time. This is incredible for a so-called toy operating system created by a bunch of so-called hackers. And finally, in the year 2000, the embedded systems developers discovered Linux. And why would they like Linux? Well, when I started off in computers, there were no such things as embedded systems because memory was simply too expensive. In about 1977 to 1980, the prices of memory had come down to the point where people could start thinking about creating an embedded system with software in it. Today, an embedded system is actually cheaper in most cases if it uses 8 megabytes of memory than if it uses 4. Why is that? because an 8 megabyte chip is cheaper than a 4 megabyte chip. An 8 megabyte chip is the one that the companies are producing in high quantity. They have to have a special run to generate a 4 megabyte chip. And so if you want 4 megabytes of memory, what the companies will tell you is, buy an 8 megabyte chip, then just don't use 4 megabytes of it. And so the dynamics of embedded systems have changed. The other thing is, when I started off in computing, we didn't have a network. A network was carrying 2,000 cards down the hallway to your friend in a box. A network was carrying paper tape from place to place. How many of you remember SneakyNet? The SneakerNet. SneakerNet is taking your floppy disk, wearing your sneakers, and carrying it down to your friend. That's SneakerNet. That's because we didn't have the internet, right? So nothing talked to anything. Your embedded system didn't talk to anything because there's nothing to talk to. But today, everything talks to everything. Your remote talks to your TV set talks to your stereo talks to your toaster talks to the refrigerator. I know you've got moldy bread in there, don't put that into me. You know. Your washer talks to your dryer. Yeah, it does. It honestly does. New washers talk to their dryers. The load is this heavy. It's going to take this much heating. There's actually a university in the United States where the students can sit in their dorm rooms and over the internet find out whether the wash and dryer is finished in the laundry room in the dormitory. The repairman can sit in his office and over the internet find out if any of the washers or dryers are broken, or if the coin holder is full, or if the lint trap needs cleaning. Or he can figure out whether or not the washer is broken, because a broken washer means you're not making any money off of it. All of this can be done off the internet because these appliances are talking to each other. How many of you have Palms or PDAs of one type or another? You know that just because you close that PDA, that doesn't mean it turns off. It's still running because it has to tell you when your calendar event is going to go off. It beeps at you, okay? All these things are running all the time. They have to be stable. They have to use different chips for different purposes. Why? I love the Alpha chip. It was made by Digital. It was the fastest microcomputer in the world. It has 64-bit address space. You'd want to use it in everything except your PDA. Because if you put it in your PDA, number one, it would wear out your batteries in about 3.4 microseconds. And secondly, whoa! It burned your hand off because it generated so much heat. You don't want to use an Alpha in a PDA. But you might want to put your Alpha in a printer or in a scanner because it can print and it can scan faster than any other chip. Still an embedded system, the right chip in the right place. But you don't want to have a different operating system. Why should you have to learn how to program something different just because it's a slightly different application? So you want an operating system that can be made small, that can fit down into perhaps 100,000 bytes of memory. You want an operating system that is stable. You want an operating system that's secure. There's nothing worse than having a hacker break into your PDA and change all of your appointment book listings. Switch male for female. Disaster. Let me tell you. Hello, Sally? No, this is Jim. Whoops, sorry. Or change single to married. Hey, you want to go out tonight, honey? Oh, where are you, bud? I'm going to kill you. Ooh. No. Bad bad stuff. Has to be secure. You don't want any royalties on the software. Why should you have to pay over and over and over again just because you're using an operating system to help your application do something? How many PDAs are you going to make? How many kiosks? And maybe you would like it to be real time. Now, right here, this is an entire server system. That's the USB bus. That's the Ethernet. It has a 32-bit CPU. It can handle 32 megabytes of main memory. It has a serial line, parallel line, ROM and RAM on it. That is a United States quarter, 25-cent piece. This is an ATM machine in Brazil. The bank had a problem. The operating system that was on their ATM machines was OS/2. And IBM was dropping support for OS/2. Remember when I talked about how long should your government last? How long should your business last? IBM was dropping support for OS/2. This bank had ATM machines out that had 386 processors, 486 processors, and Pentiums. They needed an operating system to run across all of them. Some of them had small amounts of main memory, some had larger amounts. And so they chose Linux. And they liked it so much that on every screen they have a picture of a little Tux penguin to show the Linux community how much they appreciated what Linux had done, because otherwise they would have had to upgrade all of their older ATM machines to use another operating system that was nowhere near as flexible as Linux was. So time moves on. March 2000, the dot-coms fail. And everybody expected, well, maybe this will be the end of Linux. But actually, Linux did better. Because when money is flowing freely and everybody is happy, then people say, I'll just spend more money at it. I'll throw money at it. But when things are tight, you say, I have to be more reasonable about what I do. And I have to look clearer at all of the alternatives. And they started to pick Linux as a solution. And finally, in winter of 2003, what everybody said was impossible, that you couldn't make money off of free software, Red Hat became profitable and continues to be profitable. And the other Linux companies, SUSE, Mandrake, as the Linux market grows in size, they are moving towards profitability and will be profitable. Now, there's lots of different reasons for using free and open source software. Let's say I'm talking to about 4,000 business people in a room. This is a good room, not quite 4,000 people. I ask them 3 simple questions, and then finally a 4th one. I say to the 4,000 business people, how many of you have ever had a problem with proprietary software? And out of the 4,000 business people in the room, 3,999 will raise their hands. And the reason the last one hasn't raised his hand is because he's asleep. So I ask the next question. Of the people with the hands raised, how many of you have ever taken the time to write a well-worded workaround or bug report? Now, because most of these people are business people, and because most of these people expected that when they paid money, the software would work, just like when they bought a car, the car would work. Just like when they bought a house, they could live in the house. They said 3,500 hands would stay raised because they had all turned in that problem report. Then I asked the 3rd question. of all of you who have turned in the problem report, how many of you have ever gotten back a well-worded workaround or bug fix? And I specifically added the word workaround because maybe a workaround was good enough. And now, and this is invariably happens, sometimes it's a few more, sometimes a few less, but all the hands in the room will go down except for maybe 20 people out of 4,000. And I'll say, Mr. Gates, you don't count. This is a sad state on proprietary closed source software. But the reason it happens is what I showed you before. We have 4.5 million customers. We cannot respond to all of their issues and all of their needs. It is impossible. And if you say to me, maddog, you only had 150 engineers, why don't you hire more engineers? There's a man who wrote a book called The Mythical Man Month. His name is Frederick Brooks. He said that's impossible. You can't put more engineers on a project continuously, forever, and expect that that's going to treat the situation. It doesn't happen that way. So, I ask one final question of all the people in the room. How many of you, out of 4,000 business people, have ever had to change the way you do business to meet the way the software works? And now, out of 4,000 people, maybe about 2,500 of them will raise their hands. That means a new version of the software came out. They had to retrain their employees. That means they no longer could use the printer paper they've been using for years because the format of the program doesn't match up with the printer paper. It means that they had a customer who was trained a certain way of using their website, and now they have to retrain the customer, which is even harder than retraining an employee. It means they no longer could use the old piece of hardware because the new operating system didn't work on that anymore. It means that the company who once upon a time supported the DOS operating system said, we no longer support DOS. It means that the company that they bought their software from, who used to say, you buy the software and you can use it for the rest of your life on that machine if you want to, now says you have to rent it from us for the rest of your life. And because they only have one source of that software, they have no choice. They have to do it. When there's a monopoly, it takes away your choice. When there's a monopoly, it takes away your ability to make a business decision because you no longer have that business decision to make. Recently, Red Hat Software changed their licensing practices. And a lot of people didn't like that. And those people said, okay, I'm going to go and use SUSE. Or I'm going to go and use Mandrake. Or I'm going to go and use Debian. And they could, because their applications could work with those distributions also. What happens when you say, I'm not going to use Microsoft anymore? Before Linux, there wasn't any solution. But now at least you have one. It'll cost you some money to move, but that's the price you pay for just using a monopoly. You want to keep your business decisions. Now I'm talking about today. Today, there are 500 million general purpose computer systems in the world. Desktops and low-end servers. Microsoft has about 450 million of those, mostly desktops. Linux has about 40 million server systems and relatively few desktops, although we're gaining. But what happens when the other 5.5 5 billion people in the world decide they want to use a computer system. Don't fall under the fallacy that Microsoft is every place, because it isn't. It isn't in some of these other places. You may have heard of some of these places. China, India, Brazil, Peru, Turkey. Linux is there. Don't let people tell you that Microsoft is every place. If Microsoft was every place, Steve Ballmer would not have to come here in a fit of a panic and attack because Turkey was thinking about utilizing free software in their school system. Because if Microsoft was everywhere, he could lay back in his office. He'd be done. Now, in the past, hardware was the expensive part. I just had a sign in the front seat that we should probably take a break. So we'll let you take a break. I have only about 300 slides left. And no, seriously, not quite that many, maybe 200. So let's take a break, and I think that the representatives of the LUG would like to say something about their meetings and everything. And then we'll continue on after that, and I hope to leave some time at the end for a few questions. So thank you very much, and we'll see you back later on.
Çok kısa bir şeyler söyleyeceğim. Derneğe üye olmayan kimler var? Dışarıda formumuz var. Olması bir arkadaş da getirelim, bize bir form dağıtalım. Herkesi üye yapmak istiyoruz tabii ki. Hem maddi gücünüzden küçük olsa yer almak istiyoruz ama daha önemlisi derneğin çalışmalarına daha fazla katkı verirsiniz. Dernekle ilgili birkaç şey daha söyleyeyim. Bizim bir sürü çalışma grubumuz var. Oralarda gönüllülere çok ihtiyacımız var. Şimdi web çalışma grubumuz webleri yeniden tasarlıyor. Mesela web konusunda katkılara çok açığız. Yeni başlayanlara ya da genel olarak işte sıkça belgeleme grubumuz var. Orada büyük desteğe ihtiyacımız var. Başarı hikayelerini toplayıp yazacak insanlara ihtiyacımız var. Orada önemli şeyimiz var. Etkinlik çalışma grubu, seminer çalışma grubunda çok yoğun çalışıyorlar. Küçük katkılara açığız. Şenlik için çok gönüllüye ihtiyacımız var. Mayıs ortasında Milli Kütüphane'de Ankara'da yapacağız. LKD'nin tüm etkinlikleri tabii ki ücretsizdir. Anadolu'da çok dolaşıyoruz. Orada da böyle o çorbada bizim tuzum olsun diyenleri de bekliyoruz. Derneğin listeleri var, bilmeyeniniz varsa liste.linux.org.tr adresinde listelerin bir dökümü var. Nasıl yazacağınızı gösteriyoruz. Tıklayarak üye olabilirsiniz. Listelerin arşivleri bir 95'ten beri var, 94'ten beri var. Bir arada birkaç aylığını kaybettik. Donanım sorunu nedeniyle. Ama bitimler var. Onun üzerine tarama da yapabilirsiniz. Google'dan da erişebilirsiniz. Dolayısıyla herkesi LKD'nin, ben Linux camiasının parçası olarak görüyorum herkesi LKD'ye üye olmaya, daha aktif katkı vermeye çağırıyorum ve Şenlik'te herkesi daha geniş bir çevreyle birlikte görmek istiyoruz. Şenlik diyoruz. Sadece konferanslar, seminerlerin dışında eğlenceli bir şeyler de olmasını istiyoruz. Camia birbirini tanısın istiyoruz. Yarışmalarımız var. Yılın Penguenleri yarışmaları var. Şu anda aday önerilerini almak üzereyiz. Onu yazılım hazırlandı, açmak üzereyiz. Onun adresi de Şenlik Linux.org.tr ya da Linux.org.tr'ye girince bütün bunların şeyini görebilirsiniz. Bu katkılar artsın, bu sefer daha çok işte okullardı, KOBİ'lerdi, kamuydu, daha fazla çaba harcayabiliriz. Henüz kendi mutfağımızı yeteri kadar düzenleyemedik, onun için onlara daha fazla istediğimiz kadar vakit ayıramıyoruz ama sizlerden gelen destekle ulusal işletim sistemi söylemi üzerinde daha fazla gürültü edip daha fazla bir şeyler üretebiliriz diye düşünüyoruz. Teşekkür ederim. See you.
That, of course, was a screensaver. I don't have VMS clustering working on my Linux system yet. It'll take me a couple of weeks. I would also like to put in a plug for joining a user group. I started a user group in my local community in 1995. And I have found it to be one of the nicest things that I do every week or every month as we get together, to meet with these people and talk with them and share ideas back and forth. And to go out and work on something like an installation festival where you help people install Linux and get started to using it the first time is just so much fun. And even if you think, oh, I'm not technical enough or I don't know that much, there'll be something that you can do to help out, and you become part of the community. Okay. Now, I started to talk about barriers to entry. In business terms, this means what do you need to do in order to start up a new job or start up a new program or process? And in the past, it was the hardware that was incredibly expensive to be able to do that. But now, as the price of the hardware is dropping, and you can get a computer system for about $400 US, which can do 3 billion instructions per second, and has more memory as real memory, RAM memory, than the first 20 computers I ever worked on had disk memory. It is not the hardware anymore that's the most expensive part, it's the software. And a lot of you say, well, maddog, the software came with the system. Well, maybe it did, but a certain part of the price of that system went to paying for that software. And it may be software that you don't even need or want that's sitting out there on your disk drive. If you take away that software and instead you put on a truly free operating system called Linux, a lot of times you can get what the equivalent cost of $2,000 of software basically by pulling it over the internet. And so the questions you have to ask yourself is, how hard is it software that is in your own native language? Now, fortunately, Turkey has a lot of people living in Turkey, and all over the world there's a lot of Turkish-speaking people. So the Turkish language is used by a whole series of people. But if you happen to live and work in the little country of Estonia, they only have 2.5 million people living in Estonia. And believe it or not, most of them speak Estonian. Now, one time the people of Estonia went to a large manufacturer and said, "Would you please develop your software in Estonian so that we can read the prompting that's coming out, so we can use your software?" And the manufacturer said, "Well, if I do, how many copies of the software am I going to sell?" And they said, "Well, let's see, there's 2.5 million Estonians and about half of us have computers, 5 copies. And the company said, "I'm sorry, it's not in my best business interest to supply you with software that's written in your language. You're going to have to learn English." Well, this wasn't in the Estonians' best business interest. And you see there's this problem. There are 2 different business interests. The companies that's producing the software versus the business interest of the user who's trying to use it. And believe it or not, those that make that software are not necessarily looking after your business interest, no matter how many times they tell you that they are. How much does it cost to buy some really expensive software when you're going to need like 10 copies of it for your engineers? Now, I know of software that costs $500,000 US dollars per copy, or $1 million US dollars per copy, because the number of people that use this software are relatively few, and the software does something that they absolutely have to have done, and it costs them a lot of money to buy that software. And so if you're starting up your company and you need to buy 10 copies of that software, immediately that's 10 million US dollars you've spent if the software is $1 million per copy. And finally, what happens if you're trying to do something like create an embedded system product and you need several different versions of software? You come up with the idea of a wonderful new toaster. Your toaster is not only going to talk to the refrigerator, it's going to talk to the microwave oven at the same time. And when none of them are doing work, they're going to play cards. So, you want to get your company together and you want to start doing it, but you realize that you have to use somebody else's software in your product in order to make it work. So the first thing you do is you have to hire a bunch of lawyers. Now, are there any lawyers in the audience? If there are, raise your hand. So I want to know who I'm about to insult. Lawyers, when you're starting a company, have to be, no, I won't say that. There may be somebody on paper on tape. But in any case, they use a lot of money, okay? And they don't generate a lot of toasters, okay? And so what you do is stay away from the lawyers when you start your company up because you don't have the money to pay for them. When you use software, you don't have lawyers right off the bat because all you have to do is obey the one rule of the licensing, the GPL, and you can do anything you want with it. Now, I came today from Israel, and I've visited Israel about 5 times in my life. The first 2 times, I talked about digital Unix. The 3rd time, I talked about Linux. Then I came back a year later, and I looked around Israel, and I didn't see any Linux companies. I said, Israel, what's wrong with you? You're an intelligent country. You've got manufacturing, You've got this army that goes in and does, oh, geez. You've got all this stuff. But the thing is, you don't have any Linux companies. Where are they? And they said, we're waiting for the letter of authorization. I said, the what? They said, the letter of authorization. If we were a Microsoft customer, we would go to Microsoft and they would give us this letter that says we are their representative in Israel. And then we would take this letter to Intel, and we take this letter to IBM, and we take this letter to all these companies and say, look, we're the official representative. I said, guess what? Not even Linus Torvalds can give you that letter. Why? Because you don't need anybody's permission to use Linux. You don't need anybody's permission to use open source software. You've already been given that permission to use it by the license that comes with the software. And as long as you obey the terms of the license, you don't need a lawyer. You don't need somebody to give you a letter of authorization. You can just do it. Amazing. And the next time when I came back to Israel, there were 5 companies who had started up doing free software work. Right after I went to Israel that time, I went to India. And again, here's a country who had a lot of interest in Unix. They have a lot of good software talent. And I didn't see any Linux companies. And I asked them why. And they said, we're waiting for the letter of authorization. It's like a disease. You don't need a letter of authorization. Nobody has to give you permission to use free and open source software. And so this lowers the barrier to entry. There was a country in Rio de Janeiro. This country wanted to investigate the Brazilian rainforest for new medicines, new plastics, new products of every type. But the software which they had to use was only available from the United States and cost $1 million per seat. It was a combination of software which allowed them to see what the jungles were doing, the areas of the jungles, and to do work there. The additional problem was that the software was only available in English. And believe it or not, all the people in Brazil spoke Portuguese. And when they went to the company and said, we'd like to have 18 copies of your software, would you please make it work in Portuguese? The company said no. You think for $1 million a copy, they would have said yes. But they said no. So the Portuguese people went to an open source developer, and they took along the description of what the very expensive software did. And they said, can you duplicate what this software does using open source? And the person looked at it and said, yes, I think I can. It needs a database, so I'm going to use MySQL. It needs a reporting package, so I'm going to use GNU Plot. It needs GIS software, Geographical Information System software, so I'm going to use OpenGIS. And then for the rest of the information, I'm going to use Perl and Python to hook this all together. I'm going to use the Apache web server to act as a display and a browser to act as the front end. And in 3 months, he had recreated the software that this company needed using open source. So now there's this company in Brazil that keeps 19 Brazilians employed, 18 of who work for the company itself, and the software developer who's employed part-time making changes as they need them. And those people buy Brazilian food, live in Brazilian houses, and pay Brazilian taxes. In Venezuela, they have this problem. The problem is that the university students are leaving the universities. They have free universities, not free as in software, free as in gratis. Gratis universities, the students come out of the universities, and the first thing they do is they either move to Spain or England. And I say, why are you doing this? Venezuela is a nice country. They've got beautiful land. They've got beautiful women. Not to be sexist, they have beautiful men. Okay? But the point is that these people are leaving because the Venezuelan software economy is only taking having it installed on a person's machine. There is only so much money that a person can pay to have you sit there and install software on their machine the same way that they would install software on the machine. If you say, I want $200 an hour to install this software, they're going to go, I'm going to do it myself. But if instead you could say to them, I'm going to take this software and change it so it works twice as fast in your environment, or give you a shortcut that your competition will not have, then they'll pay you more, because they don't know how to do that. But the Venezuelan economy was just packaged software. And so these students could only earn $850 a month when they graduated. And that's how much an apartment cost. They had no money left over for food, for cars, or for dating people of the opposite sex. And so they went to England or Spain that had a different economy, one where you could also earn programming. And that's where they earned the money to boost it to $3,000 a month, while their apartment still only cost $800 a month. The rest of the money they could spend on frivolous things like eating and clothes, and still have money left over for the important thing. You have to ask yourself, what type of an economy do you want for Turkey? An install-it economy? An economy that is like a McDonald's? Nothing wrong with McDonald's. Nothing wrong with flipping hamburgers. But I don't know that that's the economy that you want for your software. When I talk about a service economy for software, I'm talking about the same type of service economy as you have when you go to a doctor or lawyer or any other trained professional. Doctors make lots of money, lawyers make lots of money, but they don't produce anything. They don't have a product. It's a service. Don't kid yourself. You don't have another brain when you get finished with a doctor. You have a repaired brain. It's like an auto mechanic, a plumber. Okay? It takes skill, it takes licensing, and it gets more money than a normal service economy. Now, people ask me, what about free software in government? We've already talked about the longevity thing. You know, how long should your government last? 100 years? 200 years? How long should your software last? When people say to me, well, Mad Dog, that's why I buy my software from a large company, so it won't go into business. And I say, gee, that's just what I heard when somebody said, I bought my system from Wang. I bought my system from Prime. I bought my... These companies were. These were large companies that went out of business. I bought my computer from Cray. I bought my computer from Digital Equipment Corporation. One time the second largest computer company on the face of the earth. Business. Compaq, gone. And people say, oh, Mad Dog, Digital was bought by Compaq and Compaq was bought by Hewlett-Packard. That's true. Large software products that are no longer supported because these companies made their business decision to drop the support. They didn't care about what happened to their customers or the hardship that was brought on their customers. That was their business decision, not yours. With open source, you can make the business decision. Do I want to continue with the support of this product? Do I want to hire somebody who will study this product and make the changes for me? Maybe I can form a user group. And with the software, I get the people in the user group to pitch their money together and keep that product alive until such time as I make the business decision to move from that product. But let's talk about the government. Would you trust the software that's in your missiles, your planes, your warships to a company that was only in one country? To a company who has been found guilty by that country and by the European Union for being a monopoly and for having less than honorable business practices, have been found guilty of that. Would you trust your software to a company whose business leader cannot even take a cream pie in the face with any type of grace? Would you trust your software to a company headquartered in a country that has had an embargo against the country of Cuba for over 40 years? So long that most of us have forgotten why we ever had the embargo in the first place. By the way, it's always amazed me. Why is it that every politician and every movie star can go to Cuba and enjoy the hotels and the cigars and the booze and the dancing and the music, and none of the rest of the people in the United States could do that? If you're a politician, all you have to say is, political trip, and you go down there. You have a good time, you come back. I never understood that. But in any case, we've had this embargo. We had another country you may have heard of recently. We liked them, we didn't like them, we liked them again. The country was called Iraq. You know, we liked them, we gave them all sorts of things, chemical weapons, missiles, stuff like that, software. We didn't like them, we said, no, you're bad, we took that all away. Now we like them again. How can you do business like that? What would happen if your software was made in Iraq? Maybe the software that you're using was made by a little company in Iraq who was completely destroyed by Scud missiles. How long does it take you to get your software going again? Software is developed all around the world. It's on servers all around the world. It's worked on by people all around the world. You'd have to strike every single country with a nuclear missile to destroy it all, and even then you probably wouldn't do it. Which do you want to use for real security? Now, Microsoft talks about shared source. This is their answer to open source. But the problem with shared source is that Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. And I think he dropped out of Harvard before he studied geography, because he will share his source with 60 countries in the world. But there's over 200 countries. So which countries will he not share his source with? Little countries like China, Vietnam. I don't know if he shares his source with Turkey or not. I honestly don't know. I didn't look before I came. He may or he may not. He also shares his source with 1,000 top research universities in the world, which is a good thing he doesn't share it with China, because China has 2,400 top research universities. China would wipe out Bill Gates' university program in one fell swoop. So it's probably good he doesn't support China. And he supports the 500 top businesses, his 500 business partners, he calls them. Well, is Oracle a business partner? I would assume so. Oracle runs on top of Windows. Oracle probably sells lots of XP licenses. I would think Larry Ellison would be a wonderful business partner of Bill Gates. But you know, Bill Gates makes SQL, which kind of competes with Oracle. So I don't think that Bill Gates would share the source code for his SQL database with Larry Ellison of Oracle. How about Scott McNealy? Scott McNealy makes PCs. Windows works on PCs. Scott McNealy must be a good business partner of Bill Gates. Sun Microsystems made Java. Microsoft has Java, although not a standard Java. They changed it so it only works best on their systems. In fact, if you write to Java code on Microsoft systems, you're not guaranteed it's going to work on other systems. That was probably a mistake, wasn't it? Just like the mistake they made with Kerberos. A standard in authentication, Microsoft took Kerberos and made it non-standard. They don't do that very well, do they? They don't follow standards very well. So, shared source. Oh, the other thing about shared source is, for their mainstream products, Microsoft Office, you can look at the source code, but you can't change it, and you can't redistribute your changes. So let's put this all together. I'm a top research university in Turkey. I'm doing research on an operating system, and I'm doing research on how to make the operating system better. I find out that there's a university in China working on the same idea, and I would like to collaborate with them. I cannot do that because China cannot share the source code of Microsoft's operating system. And even if they could, when I've developed something new that I would like to distribute to the world, I cannot do that because I'm prevented from sharing that source code. Now, if you think I'm making this up, in 1992, Digital Equipment Corporation created a 64-bit version of NT to go in the alpha, and we offered this code to Microsoft. We offered this code to Microsoft, and Microsoft refused it. They said, we don't want to make our operating system 64-bit because it's not in our best business interest. It would have been in Digital's best business interest because it would have allowed our NT customers to use that very large address space. And Microsoft said no. Later on, we offered Microsoft our clustering software, known in the industry as being the best clustering software there was. And they said no. Why? Because they would have had to pay a small royalty to us for using it. Instead, they brought out their own clustering software that they didn't have to pay any royalty on. On the other hand, it was the only time I saw you bring two computer systems together and have them work half as fast as one alone. Oh, by the way, with the 64-bit code for NT, Microsoft XP operating system is still not 64-bit. You can have a 64-bit register, but not a 64-bit address space, and you will not have that until the year 2006, when Longhorn comes out. Linux has been 64-bit since 1995. So, which company was looking out for your best interests? Free and open source today. Today, Linux is shipping on 1/3 of all the new server systems coming out. Today, Linux is used on all, if not all, then almost all of the new supercomputers. Not only the Beowulf style of systems, but the NUMA style of systems being made by companies like NEC and SGI, as well as the new Vector truly supercomputers that are still under development work by people like Dr. Thomas Sterling. They're all supporting Linux. Why? Because they know that they can't afford to be creating new operating system interfaces. To get the compilers for them, the debuggers for them, and the other things, the other applications they need. By using Linux, they will have a standard operating system. If you go out to SourceForge, a place on the internet, you'll find out that there's over 74,000 applications out there and over 750,000 developers. It's actually a little bit more because my computer was stolen last week is now up to 784,000 developers. And this is without China being fully on board, or India being fully connected to the internet, or Brazil being fully on board, or even large portions of Turkey working on open source software. When that happens, that number is going to grow astronomically. And people say to me, maddog, you know, I've been out there, and while it's true that you have things like audio editors and video editors and databases of all types and operating systems and even things like CRM packages and all the rest of the three-letter acronyms we know and love, all that stuff is out there, yet a lot of those are duplicates of each other. Or the people started them and then they got tired of working on them and they went away. Maybe somebody else picked them up, worked on it a little while and went away. But even if only 1/10 of those packages or 1/10 of those people amount to something, this is still a larger number of programs and larger number of developers than any company has on the face of the earth. Microsoft has about 50,000 employees. 22,000 of them are in sales and marketing. That leaves 28,000. Now, out of the 28,000, we know they have 5 handling the telephones. The rest are Muzak. And then they have a whole bunch of them who are supervisors, staff members, systems administrators, secretaries, everything else except the word software engineer. Now, in a company that size, and I'm estimating, I would expect that they might have 5,000 software engineers. Because remember Mr. Brooks, you can't put too many people on any given project. And when I was with Digital, creating Digital Unix, we had 500 engineers working on Digital Unix. So let's be kind to Microsoft and say that they have 5,000 software engineers, people who actually develop the products. Compare that to 10% of 750,000. It's really amazing that you can go out there and grab this software, pull it down over the net, and use it. And not only use it, but change it to meet your needs. So what type of projects are out there? As I said before, databases, audio and video playing and editing tools, software development tools and languages, accounting, business, voice over IP. The new thing in telephony, voice over IP. You can talk to your computer system and make a telephone call around the world for free using free software. You don't have to pay anybody anything. You want to do video editing? You can do that too. Video teleconferencing. Computer to computer around the world for free. Security, encryption and authentication. I had a friend of mine call me up. He said, maddog, he said, the United States military knows that Linux is secure, but they want something really secure. And they said, what can you do to do that? How can you make Linux really secure? So I talked to him on the phone about the normal things of making Linux really secure. I said, but remember one thing. You have the source code. You can change Linux to be even more secure. And he said, how? I said, simple. You take out all the things that aren't secure. You take it down to the very smallest piece of code you actually need to do your work, and then it's really secure. And there was a silence on the other end of the phone because he hadn't even considered this. And then all of a sudden there was a thank you and a click. And I know that today, someplace in the United States government, there's something that's really secure. Because remember, although Microsoft will allow you to look at their source code, they have a special program where Turkey can sign up, sign a piece of paper, say it'll be good. They'll give you a piece of software. You can look over the internet at their source code pool, not all of it, just certain parts. And you can see what their source code looks like. And you can determine where there's problems with it or not. But you know something? There's nothing that guarantees that the code that you're looking at is the code that generated the operating system that you have. This is like asking Saddam Hussein to take you through his palaces looking for weapons of mass destruction. He might actually agree to it, but can you trust him? I think there was one country that said no. How trustworthy do you want to be? Because you know, Microsoft is a company in the United States. If John Ashcroft went to Mr. Bill Gates and said, Mr. Gates, either you put this code into there or we throw you in jail, what do you think Mr. Gates' statement would be? Yes, sir, Mr. Ashcroft. How many holes do you want? People say to me, okay, Mad Dog, all this has been interesting, but what about standards? Well, we understand about standards. Linux was written to standards. It was the standards that people were using when they wrote code. It's one of the reasons why it's relatively easy to bring code from Solaris systems to Linux or HPUX systems to Linux and so forth, because we supported the interfaces that people used, not the ones that they weren't using. And we formed a group called the Free Standards Group, which has the sole purpose of making sure that an application that was developed on a Red Hat Linux system works on a SUSE Linux system, works on a Turbo Linux system, and so forth. That the thing that happened to the Unix systems of dividing like this is not going to happen to Linux. And we have a certification group that certifies systems administrators, LPI, nonprofit group. All they do is certification. They do not do training. Any of you out there who own a training organization and you want to do training for Linux, you will not be competing with LPI. You can sell your training, whether it be book-based training, CD-ROM-based training, web-based training, lecture lab-based training. But what you can do is go to LPI's web pages and see what they think are the goals for each level of training. And you can develop your training around their goals that they've set. And then when your students are trained, they can take this test and be certified all over the world. So that if you want to go from Turkey to the United States and get a job, you can say, I have LPI Level 1 training and certification. I know how to be a systems administrator. Or I have LPI Level 2 certification. And they would know what that means in the United States. Or if you wanted to hire somebody from the United States to work here, if they had that certification, you would know what that means. And with support, most of the main system vendors are now offering support for Linux. But this is a different type of support than in the past. Because when you wanted to get support for digital Unix, there was only one place you could go for ultimate support for digital Unix, and that was digital. We made the operating system. We knew what it did. You didn't. If you're a value-added reseller of digitals, you probably did not have the source code. So you couldn't study the source code to figure out how some part of the operating system worked. You couldn't study the source code to find out how any part of the operating system worked. With open source, it's a level playing field. Yes, Linus Torvalds may be the architect for a Linux kernel, but I'll bet there's 1,000 other people in the world who have studied the kernel code and know it at least as well as he does. Maybe even better, because Linus concentrates on certain parts of the kernel. He doesn't pay much attention to other parts. He has other people who do that. So I bet there's people in this, in this world who know the Linux kernel better than Linus Torvalds. But that's because they could get the source code and study it. So what does this mean to you? In the early days of automobiles, if you wanted to get a fix to an automobile, you had to send it back to the manufacturer because there were no standard parts and there was no way to get replacement parts. But when Henry Ford invented the interchangeable part and the assembly line for the automobile, a little industry sprang up where people with garages could fix these cars. And an industry sprang up of people repairing cars locally. Imagine what it would be like if we had to send all of our cars back to the manufacturer to get a fix. One more car model for you. How many of you would load up a suitcase full of money and take it down to a car dealer and say, "Here, give me a car, any car in the lot, just give it to me. Take the suitcase full of money, give me the car"? Why wouldn't you do that? Every car has a steering wheel, gas pedal, brake, all the same, right? But you don't do that because you have a proprietary problem. You have a problem because you have different numbers of people in your family. You have a large dog. You get good mileage because you can't afford too much. You live in the city, so you need a small parking place. You're concerned about the safety of your car. You're going to be putting children in there. Could it be like a Mini that just kind of like crunches? Or do you want something solid to protect your children? Maybe you want a convertible so that the wind can blow through your hair, or you still have some hair for the wind to blow through. All the reasons why you buy a car. The colors, even colors. Why do so many people spend so much time on deciding which car to buy when the software for their operating system is probably going to affect them more? And yet nobody thinks anything about taking a suitcase full of money down to the local PC store and say, "Give me the software." They don't think twice about that. I'll never understand that. Maybe it's because they have no choice. For the future, we have something called the Open Source Development Labs. This is a non-profit group of companies like Nokia, Ericsson, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, software companies, Oracle, who are getting together and forming what we call carrier-grade Linux. Telephone companies, their own hardware, which is very expensive, and their own very expensive operating systems. Why? Because in the United States, we have these big snowstorms, and they deliver huge amounts of snow in the northern part of the United States. And your electricity goes off, and it's dark inside the house. And you run over to your telephone, and you pick up your telephone, and you call the electric company to complain that your electricity is out. And it never occurs to you that the telephone lines are using exactly the same telephone poles as the electricity. And that your phone is an electrical device, and yet it's still working. Why? Because the telephone company built in redundancy. The telephone company wanted something that was so dependable, so reliable, that everybody would use it all the time. We need to get computer systems to that level. We need to get computer systems so dependable and so reliable, but yet are so inexpensive that we can use them every place for every purpose. Windows XP is not it. Neither is Point working at it. And the second thing we're working at is data center Linux, something which scales to handle a problem of any size. Now, the 2.6 kernel, the one that has just been released by the kernel group, goes a long way to being in those places. And a friend of mine who is an analyst for computer companies said that 5 years ago he thought that Linux was a toy. But today he would recommend Linux to any of his customers for enterprise tasks. That's a long way to come in 5 years. So the future issues of Linux are basically not technical ones. We know we can get there. We've come in a short time a long way. The future issues of Linux are things like software contamination. Countries that want to employ their will upon your country, they want you to have something like software patents. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci trying to paint a painting. Michelangelo comes along and says, Leonardo, I patented that brushstroke last week. You can no longer use that. Oh, and by the way, that beam of light that's coming, patent that too. You can't use that. You have to figure out another way of making a beam of light. I'm sorry, Leonardo. What would happen if Mozart was sitting there composing a piece on the piano, and Beethoven came along and said, I'm sorry, I patented the triplet last week. Bling! You can't do that. You write anything else but bling! Okay? Some of the greatest music of all time may never have been written. Microsoft is in the process of patenting 30,000 software patents. Does it mean that Microsoft made those things? No, not necessarily. In the United States, you can apply for a patent for anything, and the other person has to prove that they did it before you or that there was prior art. But most people cannot afford to go to court to do that. And so imagine yourself as a programmer trying to sit there and avoid the use of 30,000 patents. That's not a job I want to have in the future. But you know something? I'm 53 years old. By the time that comes around, I won't have to worry about it. You will. And the reason that the United States is pushing this is because we recognize we're losing manufacturing jobs to China and a lot of other places. And in our minds, the only thing we have left is intellectual property as our goal of being able to invent things. Well, if people could use this intellectual property to solve their own problems, this means they wouldn't have to come to the United States and purchase that intellectual property. So this means the United States is trying to keep the developing nations from developing their own software economy. That's a problem. And people say to me, maddog, you're from the United States. Why are you coming here and telling us this? You should be happy that we implement software patents. You should want the European Union to have software patents. And the problem with that is I've been in the computer industry for 30 years. I know we still have a lot of really hard problems to solve, and I can't understand or I can't foresee all of those software patents and all those software problems being filtered through either Redmond, Washington, or Silicon Valley. I think we have to utilize the brain power of the entire planet to solve these problems. And I am not so egotistical to believe that the next Albert Einstein of computer science is going to be born in the United States. They could be born in Brazil, or in China, or in India, or in Turkey, or maybe someplace as wholly illogical as Helsinki, Finland. But whoever they are, I want to find out who they are, and I think that open source programming is the way of doing that, because when they start a really great project and lead it forward, they will shine up on the internet like a blinding light, and we'll be able to reach out and pull them in. If we have to filter them through Redmond, Washington, or Silicon Valley, we may never find them. That's a problem. And so with that, I would like to thank Linux International for support, allowing me to come around the world. SGI, Silicon Graphics Incorporation, pays my salary. My notebook that was stolen earlier this week, the one I'm using today, was lent to me by IBM. Metagroup brought me to this area of the country, and your user group helped to sponsor me to come here. But I'd like to thank you for listening. But most of all, I'd like to thank the free software community for basically generating the software that did all of these projects and many more. I'd like to mention just a few of them. In 1996, I got an email message from the Royal Navy Air Rescue Team. They had a program that they used on their Ultrix workstation that sat on their base on land. And they had ported the program using Linux to their laptop. This program helped them locate and find people lost out at sea. And so it made a lot more sense for them to take the program with them on the notebook than to keep radioing back information to the land-based. They needed some help in getting the information off of the data disk and onto their notebook, and I provided that. But I don't know how many lives have been saved because of that effort. But even if only one life was saved, it was worthwhile. I mentioned the Genome Project. The Borehole Project. In a country in Africa, there was a community project to drill wells to get clean water. There's millions of people all over the earth who do not have clean water. They drink water which is filthy, water which has disease in it. They drilled boreholes to get clean water. And each family would contribute 2 or 3 pennies a month to this project. 8,000 families, 2 or 3 pennies a month, to help to fund the project to get more boreholes. After 8,000 families, the accountant said, I can't do anymore. I'm keeping track of all this on pencil and paper. I can't do any more than 8,000 families. So they got him a simple computer system, an old 486. They put Linux on it. They had an open software developer write a simple program to help them keep track. And now the program has expanded to be 15,000 boreholes, and it still keeps growing. And the community uses the computer not only to manage the borehole project, but also to do web surfing, to allow their community to be connected to the rest of their country. If they had to buy expensive software to do this, they could not have afforded to do this project. There is a computer called the SimPuter. It's a project made in India. It looks a lot like a very big PDA. But it has a whole series of connections to it. And so in reality, you can put on disk drives. You can put on a large screen. You can attach a keyboard and a mouse. You can make an entire computer from this SimPuter. But there are 2 special things about it. Number one, the SimPuter uses as its read-write space a compact disk. And so the person who uses the SimPuter can take the SimPuter from the library, check it out like a book. They take their own compact disk with their own data on it, stick it in the SimPuter, and then it becomes their computer. So people who cannot afford to buy a $200 computer can check this out of the library, and when they're finished with it, take it back. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that in India, there are 2 different scripts. There are 18 different official languages, and there are 5,000 different unofficial languages. In addition to that, 18% of the people are completely illiterate. They do not read or write in any language. And so the SimCuter is the core of a project to allow even illiterate people to use the computer. And all of this is being done with free and open source software. There was a project one time in Portland, Oregon, a meeting of a whole bunch of companies, and they were all trying to find out how to meet the digital divide, the people who can't afford computers versus the people who can. And there were people there from Hewlett-Packard and from IBM and from all these different companies. And after they'd been talking for about a day, one of the members stood up and said, "I can't understand why anybody would want to sell software to a country where the people make less than $1 a day." And he walked out of the room. And that person was Bill Gates. And it shows where Mr. Gates had missed the mark. Because while I agree that a person who makes less than $1 a day probably could spend their money doing something else and better, their governments are trying to come up with a cheaper and better way to meet the needs of their people, to have them communicate, to have them share ideas, to have them get training and information. That's why they need those computer systems, not necessarily for the individual. And finally, there were doctors in Cuba. Cuba cannot legally use Microsoft software. Cuba cannot ask for bug fixes for Microsoft software. Cuba cannot ask for training. Cuba cannot ask for new enhancements because Cuba is under an embargo. They get their computers from Chile, and they use Linux because Linux doesn't belong to the United States. It belongs to everybody all over the world, and nobody can stop them from using it. And there were 1,600 doctors who were trying to share medical information, but the medical books that they were using were falling apart. And so they said, maybe we can copy this information onto a computer system and distribute it that way. And by using 386s and 486s that they got from Chile and Linux, they were able to create a network which allows these doctors to communicate. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your patience and your time. Open it up perhaps to that you might have. And that's basically it. I know there was one question about somebody asked me about SCO, Santa Cruz Operations, and the suits which they have against the Linux community. For those of you who do not know about this, the Santa Cruz operation used to make a package called SCO Unix, and they used to sell this and distribute it in binary-only form. Several years ago, SCO was bought by a company called Caldera. Caldera made Linux. And they decided that by buying SCO, they could perhaps use SCO's customer lists, and they could perhaps use some of SCO's technologies in Linux to make it better. But whatever happened, it was Caldera who had bought SCO who was doing this. Then what happened was Caldera basically went out of business, and the company that bought the group decided that they could make money by suing the Linux community and saying that some of the code that was in Linux was actually from their company. That's a very short description of this. Well, the Linux community disagrees that there's any code in Linux from SCO. And we simply have been saying for the last year, show us the code you're talking about, and we will gladly remove it. We don't want to have somebody else's code in our operating system. But after a year's time, SCO has been unable to show even a single line of code that they can prove in Linux. There have been two different occasions where SCO has shown some lines of code, and they said, look at this. Here's an example of the Linux code being exactly the same as ours. And the Linux community looks at that and says, oh yes, it is the same, but they both came from BSD. You copied it from BSD, and we copied it from BSD. That's entirely legal. And then SCO said, oh look, here's another example of how this code is the same. And somebody took a picture of the screen out in the audience, like people have been taking pictures of my screen. And when they showed it to the Linux community, they said, oh no, that all came from Mach, with some other place. So for the past year, SCO has not been able to show a single example of code that they could prove that they wrote and that it came into Linux. And now they've been going off suing companies, or threatening to sue companies, and saying, either you pay us an outrageous licensing fee, or we're going to sue you later on. This is extortion. This is blackmail. If I came to you and said, you pay me a fee, or sometime in the future I may throw a rock through your window, you would call the police and say you were being blackmailed. And so people come up to me and they say, Mad Dog, what about this? You know, is it possible? And I say, well, when you talk about possibilities, yes, it's possible. Maybe somebody, sometime, took a little piece of code from SCO and put it into Linux. But knowing how the Linux community works, I don't believe that this is true. Secondly, even if it is true, it now comes down to two binary decisions. The first one is there or is there not SCO code in Linux? If there is not, then we have no problem. If there is, then we go to the second binary condition. Is the code in the kernel easily removed, or is it not? Now, there are many, many ways of writing code for an operating system kernel. And that's why there's so many operating systems in the world, even though all of them have, or most of them have, the man-page virtual memory, or they have a type of scheduling algorithm, one or the other. And remember that so far the software is protected by copyright, not by patent. So that basically, if we found out that there was code inside of Linux that belonged to SCO, we would isolate that portion of code, grab a programmer or two, put them into a room and say, rewrite this section of code to do the same thing. And that would effectively have removed SCO code from Linux. That's how easy the fix would be. But we have to know what the code is. And so far, SCO hasn't shown us. They've given all sorts of reasons for this. They say, if we show the Linux community the code we're talking about, they'll simply remove it. Duh! That's what you should want us to do, right? That's what makes us legal again, right? That's what the United States copyright law says that we have a right to do, right? So why don't you show it? They say, well, if we show it and they remove it, there won't be any evidence that it was in there. Duh! There's billions of CDs all over the face of the earth that have that source code. You could go out to any, you can pull it over the net, put it on your own CD. What do you mean that there is no evidence? There either is or there isn't. And if there is, you get a lawyer to set it up, and then you can take it to court. But Cisco has done none of these things. So I don't believe that they have a case. And it's fairly obvious that IBM doesn't believe they have a case. Hewlett-Packard doesn't believe they have a case. Sun Microsystems believes they don't have a case, because if they did, they would not be putting their customers in jeopardy by saying, buy Linux. They would say, buy Solaris, or buy AIX, or buy HPUX, or buy Microsoft. Hewlett-Packard sells Microsoft, doesn't make any difference to them. It's the customers coming to them to say, we want to buy Linux. Hewlett-Packard could say, well, don't buy Linux, buy Microsoft instead because of all this troubles with SCO, but they don't say that. IBM doesn't say that. So just like the guy on the front cover of Mad Magazine, what, me worry? I got other things to worry about. I think that most of you do too. Next question. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, one thing is that Red Hat recognized that they were being pulled in two directions by two different markets. One market is the market of the enterprise, where they want stability. They want to have testing. They want to have expandability, okay? These are things which are difficult and which people need to do at a relatively slow pace. On the other hand, they're being pulled by a market which wanted what I call the bleeding edge, the very first of the first. When the 2.6 kernel comes out, they want it immediately. The enterprise says, we'll take the 2.6 kernel when everybody else has used it, and it seems like it's safe. So to have the same distribution with both sets of features is difficult. So they broke off this group called Fedora. And Fedora is aimed at the bleeding edge. Put things in as soon as they're ready. And the enterprise is aimed at the enterprise, who wants the stability and who wants the support. The people who complained the most about Red Hat with their separate licensing were the people who basically did not pay for support. They did not pay for the software on a per unit basis. They did not want the extra software that Red Hat put into it. And they were just used to pulling Red Hat down off the net for free and using it. For those people, Fedora meets most of their needs. There's one small need it doesn't meet. I'll get to that in a moment. For the most part, the people who are in the enterprise have not said anything about Red Hat's new licensing because they're used to that type of licensing and they're willing to pay money for the support. In fact, they want to pay money for the support as long as they get good support. And yet the open source nature of the software still gives them that safety blanket that says, what happens if Red Hat goes out of business? That they can find people that could help them support that copy of Red Hat until they can make a business decision of where to go next. Now the problem that I see with Red Hat splitting in two like this happens at the ISV level, the independent software vendor level. the oracles of the world. Oracle has said that they're going to support Red Hat version 3. And they're not necessarily going to support Fedora. So if you want to use Fedora on your well, there's a lot of people who say, I'm already using Oracle, I like Oracle, but the problem is I'm using Oracle maybe on a Solaris Spark system. That's very expensive. I want to use Oracle instead on an Intel Linux system, which gives me the stability that I want, the expandability that I want, but doesn't cost as much as Spark and Solaris. So they buy Oracle on top of that. Now, if you want to change your application from Oracle to something like MySQL, there's a possibility that you could be using some feature of Oracle that does not port very well. For example, Oracle had functions which could be stored inside the database.
It's a paradox that we are in a system, and system has its own mechanism. But now the open software idea is trying to dissolve this system with its own necessities. And open software idea says the knowledge should be shared by anyone without any limits. But on the other hand, people graduated from the universities, people goes to looking for jobs. People should be alive, you know. They should eat something. And in this hot area, there's a big conflict starts. Which one to have an education, which one to spend the time, which one to follow. There are too many questions becomes. I believe that the most important point is from your conversation to develop something on local open software. But we need a good combination to eat something and to develop something at the same time.
Well, I look at it as simply meeting the needs of a particular problem. And the thing is, if what you're trying to do is meet the needs of a particular problem, then yes, you may be able to use today an all open source solution. But if you're going backwards from trying to treat an already existing situation and make it less expensive, you may find that in making it less expensive, it is easier to still use a proprietary solution while the open source solution is becoming more mature. I'm a funny type of open source person because, unlike Richard Stallman, I don't believe that all software has to be completely open. I think that there are probably some examples of some software which will continue to be closed simply because there are not enough people interested in producing an open source version. Open source software typically works best bottom part of the software pyramid, where you have a huge number of people who are using a piece of software, a certain number are unhappy with it, a certain number say, I could make it better, and then even fewer numbers say, I have the talent, the time, and the drive to make it better. And the more that the computer base increases, the greater that number of people who are willing to work and have the time on that software. And so that's where it comes into being. As you go up the software tree into middleware, vertical applications, you may come to a vertical application that only 5 people in the world are interested in it. And if those 5 people are direct competitors, it may be very unlikely that any one of them has the expertise to actually make that software better. And they may have to use a closed source proprietary solution. So, you know, my most important thing is to make sure that people have choice. My most important thing is to make sure that people have an answer when a company goes out of business or when there's an embargo. I'm most concerned that you can make a business decision based on more than one answer. Because if you can't, then you can make no business decision. That business decision has been taken away from you. And open source allows you to at least investigate a different solution to your problem. You may not find a completely open source answer, but you may find large portions of it which are open source. Did I solve your question? Next question. Yes, sir.
This open source movement looks like it is a reactionary movement rather than probably I can't remember the word, gradually developing movement. It seems that the driving force is Microsoft. Everybody is trying to replace Microsoft products or concepts. Do you believe that this open source movement will carry along to the next generation? It seems that a few people are pulling this train.
Well, first of all, it isn't just against Microsoft. There are certain people who really wail against Microsoft. And actually, if I wanted to say things against Microsoft, I've actually been very nice to them tonight. But it's not just about Microsoft. When I was the product manager for Digital Unix, during one development part of Digital Unix, we made a list of 650 product requirements that were given to us by our customers. And we ordered them from the most important to the least important. And we took these to our engineers and said, these are what our customers told us they wanted. And the engineers looked at it and said, we can do the top 50 of them, and then maybe one or two of the ones lower down. And we said, what about the 600? And they said, we'll do that in the next release. Now, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you in New York City. Because in the next release, there were new standards to meet, new hardware to support, new customers to say, I'll buy your product if only you do this, which of course they never did. So the problem there was that we were trying to put all of this functionality for all of these customers into one product, instead of allowing the customers themselves to change the product to make it do what they wanted to. And then when they've done the analysis, they've done the work to give us back that change. That's much easier. Because if they don't do that, then I have to go and talk with the customer. I have to understand exactly what they want. I have to do the programming. I have to do the integration. I have to do the testing. When they do all of that and say, here it is, just work it back into your source code tree, that's a lot easier. But it's not a new thing. And this showed you that back in 1969, there were people creating free software. But the problem was, we didn't have high-speed communications like we did today. We didn't have really cheap computers like we do today, and really powerful computers. My professor would not allow me to shut down the university computer system so I could boot my next kernel of stuff on that computer, because there were 4,000 other students who wanted to use it. When the PC came along, it gave people the ability to use a really good system to do operating system research. And you could turn it off at night if you wanted to. And the 386, which inspired Linus Torvalds to start his kernel, was the first chip, Intel chip, which could actually support demand page virtual memory, which Linus knew was one of the key factors to developing a powerful computer system. I think that the open source system was put to sleep for a little while. In the period of 1980 to about 1990, it was put to sleep by people who were manufacturing software, and for a lot of people it was good enough. But it's not good enough for today's computer systems and today's problems. I mentioned the fact that there's 550 million general purpose computers in the world. If each one of those computer systems lost only $5 a day in productivity because the software didn't work properly, that means the system crashed when you were editing a letter. Viruses attacked and got into the system and slowed down the system, slowed down the server. You couldn't read mail. You couldn't do proper spam filtering. And so you go through hundreds of letters a day because the software won't allow you to filter properly. All of these things and more. If it costs you only $5 a day, then that's $2.5 billion a day as a world economy we're losing because of poor software. If we could reduce that by only $1, so we only lost $4 a day, that means we generate $550 billion or $550 million a day in productivity gain for the entire planet. And when computers get to be in the hands of another 2 billion people, those numbers will quadruple by 4. We have got to start improving the software today. We can't afford to lose productivity. You know, it's ironic, but Microsoft is beginning to change their business practices. There was 1 million computers that were purchased by Thailand with Linux on them, and they were sold to their people with Linux on them. And Microsoft found out about this and said, oh, we'll reduce the price of Microsoft operating systems and Microsoft Office to $74. This was the first time that Microsoft had ever reduced the price of their software to meet the needs of an emerging nation. They didn't do it with the standard version. They made changes to it to cripple the software in little ways. And then they said,